Hi everybody, this video is the first part in a three-part series on the Challenges to Religious Belief section of the Philosophy A-Level for WJEC. Today we're going to be looking over the first part, which is Sigmund Freud and his ideas about religion, which are basically that religion is either a neurosis or an illusion, or both. His views have a lot of nuance to them, and you kind of do need to know the nuances and the subheadings, if you will, of these ideas in a lot of detail, but I'll be giving you more than enough detail on this PowerPoint to be able to know exactly what you need to know for this section. So overall, this is the title of this sort of section, Religious Belief as a Product of the Human Mind. So religious belief and the religion behind it to Freud isn't an exterior reality, it's not an empirical idea, there isn't a God actually physically, meaningfully out there. All religion is in some way a product, or it exists only in the human mind. It's not an exterior reality. So just as a bit of context, Freud was an Austrian neurologist and father of a movement called psychoanalysis. He had many influences with regards to his study of religion. One is just the idea that religion is a dream of the human mind, and there's a really good quote that I read. I can't remember in what book, to be honest, but the guy's name was Colophon, I think I'm saying that wrong, but he said if horses had hands and could draw their god, he would be a horse, or words to that effect. So it's basically just, Freud was just influenced, I guess, by the idea that, something that's religious is nothing more than a reflection of our humanity, really. So one of the first and most important ideas you need to know about Freud is that he saw religion as a neurosis, and not just any neurosis, but a collective neurosis. So just to begin on this, we're going to talk about what's generally accepted as Freud's kind of key constituents of his psychoanalysis. So really important to psychoanalytical study is ideas about the psyche. And the psyche, according to Freud, so yourself, your being, is divided into three parts. So the first is the id or id. It's the primitive and impulsive part of your psyche. It's what Freud referred to it as was the realm of the illogical, mostly of a negative character. So it holds desires like your sex drive and stuff like that. It's not immoral, it's just amoral. So it has no ideas of morality at all. It just is what it is, it's primal. The superego is the moral part of the psyche. It's constructed for us by society, so the norms and values of the society in which you were socialised into between the ages of 3 and 5 kind of dictate how the superego works in your psyche. So the purpose, if you will, of this superego is to repress the primitive and unconscious desires of the id or the id, and this process is known as sublimation. But there's always going to be an inherent conflict between the superego and the id. One is amoral and one is moral. They're always going to be at odds. So the third part of your psyche is your ego, and this is the decision-making part of the psyche. It tries to mediate between these two opposing parts of the psyche, and this is where the idea of a neurosis comes in. So when you experience moral conflicts, often between the id and the superego, you will experience neurotic symptoms and dreams. So you don't need to know too much about sort of Freud's notions of neurosis detached from religion. You just need to know how he sort of saw a sort of harmony between religion and neuroses. So he observed a connection between the display of neurotic behaviour and some religious people. So a good example to use is wudu, so like the ritualistic washing in Islam, and some OCD symptoms. Now, neurotic patients don't actually understand the meaning of their actions, while religious people have faith in a divine purpose or even ordination. So a good little quote to drop in there is from your predestination unit, so overridden by sin, and doesn't that sound a bit like a neurosis to you? You feel constantly dirty, you always feel like you're inherently wrong and evil no matter what you do. So such behaviour was the repression of unconscious desires, which were viewed as temptations, and these rituals are an unconscious protective measure against the action that leads to guilt. So, you know, if you confess your sins and stuff like that, it kind of protects you from sinning. So another key idea is that of displacement. So for example, you displace a fear of an actual thing onto something else. So to use an example, doing something God approves of, but then you disapproves of, but then you displace that action onto the notion of a ritual, confession, or prayer. And over time, the practice itself becomes the essential thing. So, you know, if you have OCD, maybe you have to go and shut all your doors in your house before you leave the house. And over time, whatever you shut the doors to mitigate against, be that your family dying or something like that, eventually shutting of the doors becomes the essential thing. Similarly with confession, praying, and stuff like that. So there are two really important subheadings that you need to be familiar with regards to Freud. One is the Primal Horde, and the other is the Oedipus Complex. We're going to do the Primal Horde first, as exemplified by that lovely little photo, which I was there right now and not learning about this. So the Primal Horde is, quote unquote, a group of savages centering around a dominant member. Now, you know, according to Freud and Darwin, to an extent, these primal societies were patriarchal, so it would be a man. Freud sort of discussed this in his book Totem and Taboo, which was influenced by Darwinism, which is sort of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and also social Darwinism, which is the idea that survival of the fittest kind of applies to society as opposed to just biology. So this is Freud's theory. So, you know, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, you know, in some field near you, the Primal Horde existed with a dominant male head, if you will, patriarch. This patriarch had authority over all the females, including sexual authority. So ambivalent young males who weren't the leader of the pack wanted to replace this patriarch, but yet they also had respect for him as a leader and a father. So this created extreme conflict within them. In the end, this conflict led the sons to kill the father for accessing the females, but of course they felt guilty about this. So in order to sort of atone for their guilt, they totemized, deified their father as a sort of signifier of post-mortem respect. So this killing of the father was allegedly commemorated and reenacted in religious ritual, which Freud, you know, quote unquote, says survives in the form of communion. We're talking about a feast, we're talking about drinking blood, eating flesh, just like, according to Freud, happened in this sort of primordial society. So taboos formed as a result of the guilt, stuff like, you know, do not kill, do not commit incest, stuff like that. And Freud sort of mainly argues, and this is where you need to tie it back to religion all the time, that religious guilt stems from this cultural memory and inherited primal guilt. Fairly simple to remember, just remember to link it back to religion at all times. So moving on to the green box, religion as a neurosis, and we're talking about the Oedipus Complex here. So Oedipus was a really twisted Greek myth. He was the mythical king of Thebes. Yeah, twisted story. He killed his father and married his mother. Anyway, Freud kind of starts with the assumption that guilt plays a really important role in the psyche. So does sexuality and the sex drive, which is capable of causing huge psychological problems. But yet it's also the most basic instinct, which necessitates sort of inherent conflict within one's psyche. So the son's bitterness towards the father is due to the father's prevention of their sexual desires. Again, we're talking about this patriarch who can control everyone, and this is extremely frustrating for young boys, perhaps rightly so, I don't know. So this sexual frustration sort of is identifiable between the ages of 3 and 6, according to Freud, with young boys having a love affair with their mothers. They see their fathers as rivals for their mother's love, for their mother's attention, but they really, at the end of the day, fear their father. So this leads to 3 main fears for boys. They're all sort of similar. The first being that he will lose access to his mother's breasts, which because of breastfeeding and stuff like that, the boy believes is part of him. Sexual exploration leads to negative consequences. So we're going to look at one of those in a case study eventually, but this leads to a fear of losing his penis. And fear 3 is the idea that you know, when young boys learn that some people don't have a penis, he believes that this was a punishment for either this sexual exploration or possibly for replacing their father and, you know, experiencing the repercussions. It's a bit strange. So both the Primal Horde and the Oedipus Complex share features of the desire to eliminate the father, and the guilt from both of these mutates into these neurotic symptoms that we were talking about before, and these neurotic symptoms are expressed via the immaturity of religion. So you may be wondering, what is a fairy godmother from Shrek doing on this slide? Because we're talking about wish fulfillment, of course. So in the book The Future of an Illusion, I don't know if I just had an abridged copy or if it generally is just really short, but I'm actually not going to recommend you read this. I read the whole thing and I can't remember a single word of it. But he still kind of maintains, Freud this now is, that religion is an illusion based on the yearnings of the superego. Now, what are illusions? This is a very long list for kind of summing up the idea that they attempt to resolve unconscious conflict. They are untrustworthy, not because of their source, which is like yourself, and not that necessarily their content. I will let you read through those by yourself. I think it's quite obvious what an illusion is. So religion comes from our deepest desires, so, you know, the wish to escape death, enjoy true justice, and these are common across all cultures. God's attributes are a reflection of human hopes to exceed limitations. So, you know, God being holy, this reflects our like innate desire to be pure, quote unquote, and free of sin. Now, religious doctrines were not devised ex nihilo according to Freud. They are invented, essentially, fueled by the desire to legitimize the deepest wishes. You could link this to some Christianity sections, so it's not plural verbal inspiration. You know, God didn't dictate every word of scripture or doctrine. They're just made up to legitimize our feelings of sort of helplessness, which we'll go on to in a minute. So religion as an illusion, reaction against helplessness. You know, in the grand scheme of society and in the world, in fact, humans are helpless in the face of nature. So religion creates security by personalizing, anthropomorphizing, personifying the forces of nature. So, you know, think of like specific saints or even Greek gods. You could bring any religion here. Freud does generally focus on the Abrahamic religions, but sometimes this is more obvious in sort of pagan religions, earlier religions, which really reinforces his point, I guess. Apart from just the exterior forces of nature, we also struggle with interior forces, such as feelings of aggression, which religion limits, a sex drive, which you know may be unhealthy, but you can't help yourself, and then you bring in sexual ethics like that. But overall, with this slide here, Freud sort of makes the point that all this is quite childish. You know, we don't need someone else to give our lives meaning. We don't need somebody else to absolve us of responsibility for our actions. We don't need to repress what is natural for a fake promise of post-mortem justice or reward. So we're going to look at the case studies, just not in very much detail here, but these are just some of the case studies for Freud. So there's one about little Hans. Little Hans was a little boy. He hated his father because I think he had castration anxiety and wanted to marry his mother, I think. He had a severe fear of horses, but in reality he wasn't actually scared of horses, according to Freud. He was scared of his dad because the little blinkers on the horses apparently looked like his dad's glasses. So this guy, whose name I can't pronounce, was one of the other case studies by Freud. He allegedly displaced homosexual desires under the belief that he was the Messiah. There was a little guy called Ratman, not illustrated by the picture on the right, who allegedly displaced his fear of the death of loved ones onto obsessive actions. I'm pretty sure he would pay his local law enforcer or something to allegedly ward off criminals or something like that. Maybe look into these in a little bit more detail, but I think you only really need to know briefly how they would support Freud's hypothesis. And Wolfman had a castration anxiety, which he displaced onto the fear of animals. Another area of support is instinctive desires deriving from an evolutionary basis. So we're kind of talking about Darwinism. Darwinism has been peppered into this theory since the beginning, probably because Freud was a bit of a fanboy of Darwin by the looks of it. The Origin of the Species is the most important book ever written, according to Freud. Yeah, simp. So one thing that Freud did claim was that ontogeny mirrors phylogeny. So he's basically saying that the study of the individual mirrors the study of society, which, as we were talking about earlier with social Darwinism, could be seen as being true to an extent. We're going to rip all this apart in a few moments, so don't worry about it. But overall here, Freud is sort of saying that all behaviour, including the religious, is a product of a few survival instincts. So, you know, your sex drive, your desire to survive, self-preservation, etc. He also cited Lamarckian, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, evolutionary biology, which was widely accepted at the time, and is the idea that characteristics acquired in an organism's lifetime can be passed on to offspring. Now, this one's the easiest one to rip apart, but this sphere of evolutionary biology kind of says that if you get something in your life, so for example, a tattoo, a scar, something like that, then that can theoretically be passed on to any offspring you may have. A scar, a tattoo, or perhaps primal guilt. But we will rip this apart very quickly. So, challenges, as promised. There is literally no evidence at all for the Primal Horde. None at all. Darwin, when Darwin referenced it, quite openly said that it was kind of a speculation, and by Freud's literal own admission, it's never been observed. How can you observe this stuff that allegedly comes from, you know, the primordial very beginnings of humanity? And in fact, I don't know if any of you have read *Sapiens*, the book in the bottom right-hand corner, fabulous book. I may be butchering Yuval Noah Harari's thing. I think I remember him saying that primitive communities were actually more egalitarian. It wasn't this massive patriarchy. So in fact, Freud's views are just a product of his social context, really. This is my favourite quote to use against Freud. Freud makes the accidents of social history the necessary truths of human nature. Alistair McGrath, that is an absolutely fatal critique. I'll leave you to sort of unpick what McGrath's saying there, but really, it's fatal. As we were alluding to on the last slide, this primal guilt is literally impossible. You cannot pass guilt onto your offspring. You just can't do it. You could actually use the same line of argument against the idea of massupicati, or inheriting the sin of Adam, seminally present in the loins of Adam, anything like that. You can't pass it on. You know, genetic science has completely disproved this. Same with the ontogeny phylogeny link. There is no psychological evidence for the Oedipus Complex either. Well, a universal Oedipus Complex, perhaps it would develop in certain people, but the idea that it's universal is completely unproven. Malinowski, who was an anthropologist, sociologist, disproved the notion in his book Sex and Repression in Savage Society. He studied some Pacific Island people, and he noticed that in cultures such as that culture where the father figure is less important, there's no Oedipus complex present in society at large at all. So this is just androcentrism, which, you know, you could maybe even bring in some feminist theologians here, as long as you don't forget that this is I'm talking about Freud here, you don't bring in too many other theorists. Interesting idea here. Religion may cause neurosis, not neurosis causing religion. Think about religion's strict rules, maybe think about like food laws, voodoo, like we've talked about before, the idea of confession. Like maybe it's the other way around than what Freud is actually saying. The evidence basis is too narrow. As I've mentioned before, Freud allegedly, well, he had Jewish lineage, so his study was really just focused on the Abrahamic religions, and and it had a special vendetta for Christianity, really. And he generalized from a section of people who were literally not representative of the whole population at all. They were severely mentally ill. And then just like a little bit of like miscellaneous critiques down here. Karl Popper is not falsifiable. You could use the idea that it's not verifiable either, if we want to bring in other nice synoptic links there. They evade any sort of empirical test, which is kind of the same thing as non-falsifiability. Now, this is actually a nice little quote, and I use this one for Richard Dawkins as well sometimes, when Richard Dawkins is accused of being, endorsing scientism. Freud erects the messiahship of science without observing that scientism is itself a faith of illusion. Now, I've talked what scientism is in a previous video, so I'm not going to go into that now, because it is just miscellaneous. It's not like specifically on the course. But that is another quite damning critique of Freud. So that is it for Freud. Next time we'll be moving on to Carl Jung, who has similar ideas about some aspects of religion and very differing views on the usefulness of it. Thanks, guys.